So thanks to this decision, we can now properly file to proceed with these numerous policies and those that have been wrongly enjoined on a nationwide basis, including birthright citizenship, ending sanctuary city funding, suspending refugee resettlement, freezing unnecessary funding, stopping federal taxpayers from paying for transgender surgeries, and numerous other priorities of the American people. We have so many of them. I have a whole list.
Well, as you heard, Donald Trump has a whole list of illegal and unconstitutional things that he plans to do now that the Supreme Court has effectively given him king-like power to override the U.S. Constitution. And yes, you heard that correctly, and it's not hyperbole. So let me explain. On Trump's very first day in office, he signed an executive order banning birthright citizenship, which is not something that he can do, since that is a right codified in the 14th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. You can't just sign it away with an executive order, hence why multiple lower court judges blocked it from going into effect. But Trump didn't like this, so his administration asked the Supreme Court to stop lower court judges from issuing these nationwide injunctions that stop him from violating the Constitution. Didn't matter that his executive order was blatantly unconstitutional. Well, no, because the Supreme Court sidestepped the unconstitutionality of his executive order altogether, and they just narrowly looked at the authority of lower courts. It didn't matter if lower courts were right on the substance. The question was whether or not lower courts should have this power to block a president in the first place, even if what they're blocking is unconstitutional. And in a 6-3 decision, the Supreme Court said, no, lower court judges should not have the power to stop presidents from doing unconstitutional things, which means that presidents can essentially now do whatever the fuck they want, Constitution be damned, at least for a while. Because sure, the Supreme Court might be able to stop them from doing unconstitutional things, but it takes time for an executive order to make its way to the Supreme Court. So in the interim, a president's unconstitutional executive order can take effect. So, I mean, think of it this way. If a Democratic president gets elected, for example, and chooses to override the Second Amendment and order all guns to be immediately confiscated, no court can stop them, with the exception of the Supreme Court, but it would take time for the issue to work its way through the system all the way up to the Supreme Court. And during the period where it's going through the system, the president's illegal order can take effect. Nationwide injunctions would have prevented presidents from abusing power, but now anything goes, at least temporarily. And in order to stop the president from confiscating your guns, if we're going with the same analogy, you would have to sue the federal government yourself to get relief, because another plaintiff's lawsuit couldn't affect you as a gun owner, since these nationwide injunctions aren't going to stop a president from doing something that affects all people who own guns. Another question is, what would happen, say, the year that all of these guns were confiscated and the Supreme Court ultimately said, no, that's unconstitutional, you can't do that? The answer is, who knows? Our entire legal system has been thrown into chaos because of this decision, and the Constitution is now just a recommendation, not a requirement. Now, with that being said, nationwide injunctions aren't perfect. Activist Republican judges, for example, blocked President Biden's agenda for partisan reasons. But as Elie Mystal put it in an article for The Nation, though flawed, nationwide injunctions make sense when it comes to national issues involving civil and human rights. Issues like, say, the Constitution's very clearly stated definition of national citizenship. After all, one's fundamental rights should not wildly change if they miss their exit on the interstate. But because of this decision, Trump's blatantly unconstitutional executive order banning birthright citizenship is now going to take effect. And babies born in America going forward, at least for the foreseeable future, might not actually be citizens, depending on where they're born. But assuming the Supreme Court one day does strike down Trump's unconstitutional executive order here after letting it go into effect, what happens to all of the babies that were born who weren't given citizenship? How do you remedy the situation? Will the Supreme Court retroactively make them citizens, or will we have a generation of stateless people living in the country who are denied their constitutional right? It's a fucking mess. And if you watched my previous coverage of this issue, which I'll link to down below, I talk about the comically stupid legal argument that the U.S. Solicitor General arguing for Trump made in defense of this decision. First of all, even Kavanaugh seemed stunned by their inability to explain how something like this would be enforced, and Barrett joined the liberal justices multiple times to challenge Trump's attorney on the stupidity of his arguments. But in the end, all 6 conservatives sided with Trump, and Barrett, who seemed the most reasonable out of all the conservatives during oral arguments, ended up writing the majority opinion. And the arguments she concocts here are so laughably stupid, I can't help but question if she was high when she wrote this. Elie Mystal explains, her principal reasoning for this is the High Court of Chancery in England, which existed at the time of the adoption of the Constitution. I wish I were making this up, but I'm not nearly creative enough to do it. Barrett and the rest of her Republican colleagues determined that nationwide injunctions cannot be used in 2025 to stop a president from violating the Constitution of the United States because the High Court in England, which existed during a time of hereditary monarchy, did not use a historical equivalent of a nationwide injunction to enforce the laws against Czech's notes, their king. Originalism often leads to ludicrous arguments, but this one really takes the cake, or crumpet as it were. We're living in a world where 6 Republican Supreme Court justices use the courts of a monarchy we revolted against as the controlling authority on whether the president of the United States has to follow the Constitution. And Barrett doesn't stop there. She isn't sure that any American court can make Trump follow the law. It's unclear if she thinks an English court could do it. She writes, no one disputes that the executive has a duty to follow the law, but the judiciary does not have unbridled authority to enforce this obligation. In fact, sometimes the law prohibits the judiciary from doing so. According to Barrett, the law is a mere suggestion to Donald Trump. She hopes he follows it, but if he doesn't, there might be nothing the courts can do. Except there was, but she stopped them from doing that. Thanks, Barrett. Really appreciate it. Now, Elie Mystal goes on to make a really chilling point about how the last time that the Supreme Court addressed the question of citizenship, it ended in the Dred Scott ruling, where in a 7-2 decision, the Supreme Court said that a black slave and his family could not be freed and that they couldn't attain citizenship. As you all know, a civil war came next. But Mystal says that the racists are now winning their second civil war without having to fire a single shot. It is really bleak. And the conclusion was equally bleak from Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson, who says, eventually executive power will become completely uncontainable and our beloved constitutional republic will be no more. In other words, a Supreme Court justice is saying the American experiment might actually be over. It's not like we were ever a real democracy to begin with, but whatever this was, we're no longer working towards a better version of it. It's just all coming undone. And to be clear, there's plenty of things that have happened that paved the way for our descent into dictatorship, but it really feels like they pulled the final thread that made the whole system unravel with this particular case. It truly feels like we've reached the point of no return here. And keep in mind that the same Supreme Court also gave Trump near absolute immunity. So no other institution has laid the groundwork for the death of democracy more than the Supreme Court, the institution that is supposed to protect the Constitution. They are enabling Trump's dictatorial ambitions. And ironically, a former Supreme Court Justice, Anthony Kennedy, is suddenly sounding the alarm about democracy being at risk. Not necessarily because of this decision, but, in general, based on the environment that Trump has cultivated. He said many in the rest of the world look to the United States to see what democracy is, to see what democracy ought to be. Not anymore, bitch. If they see a hostile, fractious discourse, if they see a discourse that uses identity politics rather than to talk about issues, democracy is at risk. Freedom is at risk. He added, judges must have protection for themselves and their families. Our families are often included in threats. Except Kennedy chose to let the man responsible for the situation choose his successor. Kennedy also wrote the majority opinion for Citizens United, one of the biggest death blows to democracy in modern history, a decision, by the way, that this court is poised to revisit and expand upon again, as HuffPost reports. So we've been moving closer and closer towards the point of no return, little by little, but this decision right here could truly be the tipping point. They gave a fascist wannabe dictator who tried to overthrow the last election near absolute immunity and the power to at least temporarily override the U.S. Constitution with executive orders. This is not really something that democracies can recover from. But as I said in my last video about this, if the Constitution doesn't matter and presidents can do whatever they want, Republicans better hope that we never have free and fair elections again for their sake. Because if a Democrat gets in, I want Medicare for all on day one with an executive order. Okay? I mean, if that executive order inevitably gets struck down, then I guess the Democrat just goes, oh, well, gee golly, I think that it's constitutional, so let me just change it a little bit, and we'll push that through again, and people will have health care in the time being. I mean, there's nothing stopping them from going full Fidel in this bitch. They could seize the means of production at corporations, nationalize entire industries, throw billionaires in gulags, all without congressional approval, apparently, since no lower court can stop him. And whatever a president does, well, there's going to be a period of time where that has to be adjudicated in the system and has to work its way all the way up to the Supreme Court. And according to Amy Coney Barrett, well, they might not even be able to stop the president. I mean, Kavanaugh says that the Supreme Court, in his concurring opinion, can stop them, but it's kind of an open question, according to the person who wrote the majority opinion. So this is what happens when you open the door to dictatorships. We didn't ask for this. I don't want to live in a dictatorship, but this dictator-like system was forced upon all of us by power-hungry fascists. So if Republican presidents are effectively kings, Democratic presidents are effectively kings too. This is the bet that Republicans have made for our country, and they have to lie in it too. They have to deal with the consequences of the system that they created for all of us. So buckle up, because the next president better be unfucking restrained. I expect the most transformative agenda in American history. I expect an FDR-like president all through executive orders. This is what Republicans wanted, so this is what they're gonna fucking get.
Do yourself a favor and click the join button on YouTube to become a member. Because Mike's doing a great job. Getting to watch his videos before everyone else is tremendous. Many people are saying this. Join today, folks. You won't regret it.